Hi, my name is Alekos, and I just started my senior year of high school at Sacred Heart. Today, I'm going to talk about tattooing. I chose this topic because I think it's a beautiful and meaningful art form, but sadly has a lot of stigma attached to it. My hope is that through spreading information about the history and significance of tattooing, I could help to decrease that stigma a little bit. So a tattoo is a form of body modification in which ink is deposited into the skin to create a permanent design or pattern. Scientists and anthropologists estimate that the practice of tattooing began about 10,000 years ago. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when or where tattooing first occurred because the skin or canvas on which it took place has decomposed. But evidence from the carbon dating of sharp needle-like objects stained with human-made inks found all over from Europe to the Philippines indicate that tattooing was relatively common amongst early humans across the world. However, these practices slowly began to die out in much of the Western world. Moving towards modern times, tattooing thrived in parts of Asia, Africa, and especially Polynesia, from where it was eventually reintroduced into the Western world. It's a little frozen. There we go. You might be wondering why someone would even want to get a tattoo. They sound painful, and would you really want to have something on your skin forever? In those places where tattooing remained a common practice, tattoos held a great deal of cultural significance, and actually the meaning behind them addressed those very concerns. A tattoo is a physical representation of something intangible, like a memory, an experience, or an identity. The permanence of a tattoo can help someone to cope with the impermanence of the human experience. In many native cultures, even the design and the placement of tattoos have meaning. For example, in traditional Polynesian tattoos, the placement gives meaning to the piece. So if it is on a joint like your shoulder, it represents a relationship with another person. The pain experienced when receiving a tattoo is also viewed as a rite of passage into adulthood in many tribes in both Africa and Polynesia. This image on the screen of a traditional Maori face tattoo, and each man in the Maori tribes would receive a face tattoo when they became an adult. These served as a sort of identity card, and no two of these tattoos were the same. We're having some lagging again. Oh, there we go. So I want to quickly talk about some different tattoo techniques. So one you might be most familiar with is the machine tattoo, which is on the screen right now, which actually wasn't invented until 1876. The machine pokes many needles dipped into ink into the skin, which is just a faster and automated version of traditional tattooing. Another modern form is hand poking, in which a single needle is poked into the skin without a machine. Scarification does not utilize ink, and the patterns created through created through the cutting and healing of the skin. This kind of body modification was extremely common in many African tribes. Hand tap tattooing originated in Polynesia, in which one stick contained sharpened bone or tooth dipped in ink, and the other tapped that stick into the skin repeatedly. Irizumi is a traditional Japanese form of tattooing in which many small needles are attached to a bamboo stick and pushed into the skin. So tattooing was reintroduced into the West when sailors on Captain Cook's ship arrived in Hawaii to colonize the Pacific Islands. Many of these sailors received traditional Hawaiian tattoos from natives. And when these sailors returned to Europe, they were most Europeans' first exposure to tattoos. So tattoos became associated with sailors very quickly. And generally, those who went into sailing during that time period were of a lower socioeconomic class. So the rejection of tattooing in the West is really rooted in classism. It also stems from racism. As I've talked about, tattooing was a very important part of many native cultures across the world. And colonization has really erased native culture. Throughout America, many aspects of native culture have even been criminalized. For example, until the late 1960s, it was actually illegal to teach or speak the native Hawaiian language, and such was the case with many other native languages. So you can imagine the impact this sort of criminalization of Native identity had on the cultural practices that are associated with that identity. Tattooing has also been used, sadly, to forcibly mark people as property of others. And this was a common practice in the Persian Empire, where people they conquered were tattooed to signify their inferior status in society. A more modern example of this is tattoos were even forced upon people in the Holocaust, as can be seen in the top right image, to dehumanize them. So these darker aspects of the history of tattooing have sadly created a lot of stigma that the practice bears. But I hope through spreading information about this beautiful and meaningful art form and understanding where the bias comes from, we can really begin to break down the stigma surrounding tattooing. Thank you.